Senator Rennick.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I too won't be supporting this bill because I don't actually believe in digital currencies. I think it's a stepping stone to the social licence, and I believe that the currency should be controlled by the government of the day. Now, I will stand here and I will tell you that I do not want the government in the family home, in the boardroom, in the doctor's waiting room, in the classroom. But there is one thing that I do think government should regulate, and that is the currency. Digital currencies are used to traffic drugs, they're used to traffic children, they're used to traffic weapons. There is no way that ASIC will ever be able to keep up with tracking digital currency. ASIC can't even do its job now properly. The idea that we're going to actually think that we can regulate digital currency is just a fantasy. And let me tell you, that's what this is a market for. This is a market. I mean, we may as well have a market for unicorns and fairies if we're going to try and regulate this, because that is all that digital currency is. It is a world of make-believe, of bytes of 0 and 1. If we want to get this country back on its feet, we need to start producing real goods and services. We need to be building infrastructure. We need less white-collar spibs in their ivory palaces in Sydney and Melbourne, and we need more people back on the tools, not trading imaginary figures on a computer screen. And it's very, very important that we understand how important controlling currency is. And it's actually one of the reasons why, and I'm one of the few people in this chamber that actually believe this, that the RBA should actually come under the control of the Treasurer and should not be independent from government. And I'll just read out to you the history of coins in the early colony, because controlling currency is everything. When Australia, in modern Australia, in the first colony, for the first 17 years, didn't really have its own currency. And if you want to actually regulate your country and control your country, you've got to have a currency. But I'll just read out a paragraph about currency in the early settlement. The coins in the pocket of the passengers on the first fleet were a mixture of currencies from all around the world, and included English guineas, shillings and pence, Spanish dollars, Indian rupees and Dutch guilders. It was confusing to try and use these coins to trade, because no one knew how much they were worth when compared to each other. This coin confusion meant that other ways of trading were used. People bartered for goods and services with anything they had. Food and rum became popular items to trade as well. And of course, we all know what happened with the rum rebellion. It literally went the proverbial up. And of course, luckily enough, we had Lachlan Macquarie, who came along in 1810. And he was the first governor to see Australia not as a colony but as a country. And he knew that if you wanted to be a good governor for your country, you needed a military to defend your borders and provide law and order, you needed a taxation system, and you needed a monetary system. And he introduced the holy dollar. And that holy dollar was used to fund Sydney Hospital, the Sydney Barracks, that still stand in Macquarie Street today. And that is what we have to do, as good government involves regulating and controlling your currency. And as I just want to repeat, when it comes to the government going into your personal lives, I'll fight for that any day. But when it comes to defending the right of a government to control your currency, we have to make sure that that is in the control of the people. Because the history of monetary policy is the history of wars. And if we go back to the great patriots of 1776, that was actually, believe it or not, a currency war, because in 1764 the British imposed the Currency Act, and that was where they told the American colonies they couldn't use the colonial script. And as Benjamin Franklin said, that was the reason for the Revolutionary War, because if you're not allowed to use your own script, your own paper, because let's not forget that all currency is an arbitrary construct. Whether it's a digital form of currency or a piece of paper, all that indicates is that you should be able to swap that for something that is tangible. We've got to get back to basics here. But if you're printing this stuff out of thin air, you've got to have very tight regulations around it. Now, by the British imposing the Currency Act on the American colonies, that meant, and if you don't, you can't print your own currency, that means you've got to borrow a currency. And if you've got to borrow a currency, that means you've got to pay interest on that currency. And of course, that meant the wealth was going out of the colonies and it was going back to Britain. And of course, we saw the same thing happen 200 years later in 1973 with the creation of the petrodollar. And I'll call it the petrodollar. Most people think the US dollar is actually owned by the great people of the United States, but that's not true. The Federal Reserve is privately owned, and when any country uses US dollars, they are effectively paying interest to the private banks that own the Federal Reserve. And yet again, I have a problem with that, and I'll say to my good friends in the United States, take back control of your printing press, because you actually didn't realise this in 1913, but those private bankers won the day. So this is very, very important that we get this right. So I just want to stress, I'm going to go through the history now because it's very important. So we go from the Currency Act and then we'll jump 100 years. So the whole history of the United States through the 19th century was all about who was going to control the currency, the private sector and the private banks, or the government of the day. Now, in 1896, a bloke by the name of William Jennings Bryan gave this speech, and he said, and it's known as the Cross of Gold speech, silver and gold. Interestingly enough, he went up against William McKinley, and he lost that election, but he ended up staying in the US Congress, and he actually became Secretary of State under Wilson in 1912. But interestingly enough, he actually became immortalised in a book known as The Wizard of Oz, and he was actually the lion. So William Jennings Bryan rhymes with lion, and The Wizard of Oz was a story about the history of monetary policy. And effectively, Dorothy represented the American people, the Tin Man represented the worker, and the Scarecrow represented the farmer. And in the original story, the yellow brick road represented the gold, and Dorothy actually wore silver slippers, not ruby slippers. And of course, Emerald City was the colour of the US greenback, and of course the person behind the curtain, of course, the Wizard of Oz, was the symbol for the central banker. And of course that's what we have today. We have these nasty little central bankers that operate in the background, and we know that because in estimates I actually asked the current, she was the deputy at the time, Michelle Bullock, for the minutes between the RBA and the International Bank of Settlements. Now, if you've never heard of the International Bank of Settlements, they are the central banker for the central banks. And of course she wouldn't give me those minutes. Now, I think that's an absolute disgrace that a senator, a person elected by the people to represent the people, that a public and unaccountable independent governor will not give the minutes of those meetings to a senator who wants to share that with the Australian people. And that's not the only sneaky business the RBA is up to as well. As I've said before, I've actually got the serial numbers and the date of minting of our gold bars that are held with London, and those gold bars have all been refined since 2014, as late as 2020. And the reason why the central banks don't want you to get a hold of the gold is because that is a tangible store of wealth. And if they ever people ever find out that the real medium of exchange is gold or land, which is the hard asset, that's the stuff that matters, because paper deflates away. It's currently deflating away at 7% a year. You would find that people would be up in arms. And trust me, if you actually look at the Commitment of Traders report, I look at it every Saturday morning to see what's going on with the gold, you will notice that that's also manipulated. And interestingly enough, as we were going through September, the number of shorts held by the banks was actually decreasing, and it actually decreased right down to the first week of October, and since then it's rapidly increased. And I'll let you guys join the dots on that one. But we'll jump forward then to 1913, where the Federal Reserve was actually created, and it was actually set up as an independent, privately owned bank. And needless to say, what happened after that was that World War I broke out the year after that. And of course Germany went on to lose that war, and they had their bank nationalised after World War I, and the German people were forced to repay the debts from World War I. Interestingly enough, that of course led to World War II, and interestingly enough, after World War II, the Bank of England, which was privately owned, was also nationalised. And of course the British, and I say this to my British friends, my good British friends, you do realise you actually lost World War II. You actually got shafted because your Bank of England, which shouldn't have been privately owned but it was nationalised, and then the debts were stuck from World War II onto the British people, and it took them 60 years to repay the debts back to the Federal Reserve. And interestingly enough, that's how the wealth from the old world went to the new world. But we jump forward, and in 1953, a great US president, probably my favourite US president, along with Kennedy, actually in his first speech gave another speech, and it's called The Chance for Peace. But in that last paragraph he says, "We will not be hung on a cross of iron." And that was his reference to basically to say that all wars are bankers' wars. And of course we know his speech in 1961 where he called out the military-industrial complex and the scientific and technical elite. But he was onto this way back in '53, because by saying, and he knew what he was talking about, this bloke commanded D-Day, he was head of NATO, president for 8 years, and also head of Columbia University. If he says there's a military-industrial complex, trust me, there's a military-industrial complex. But it's interesting that in '53 he even mentions that same thing. But my point is that the control of the printing press has been fought for years and years and years, and we cannot let that go into the hands of unnamed operatives who will actually use that. Now, we hear issues with ASIC and AFCA and all of these things all the time. This will end up in tears. And I think I just read this morning that there was allegations that the current tragedy unfolding in the Middle East at the moment has been funded by cryptocurrency in terms of buying weapons. And we cannot allow this stuff to go underground. I think it's incredibly dangerous, and it takes our eye off the ball. True wealth is the stuff we see in front of us, is the production and capacity to produce goods and services. And of course, interestingly enough, we go back to 1971, they dropped the gold standard in the end, and they had to drop the gold standard because of the Vietnam War, because they were printing too much money and they couldn't keep up with the gold. Needless to say, inflation took off because they were printing money without which does increase demand, but they weren't using it to increase supply. Just like we did in COVID, we printed $300 billion and paid people to stay at home. Had we printed $300 billion and used that to build infrastructure that increased the supply of goods and services, we would have actually not had this inflation problem, and we would have been able to keep people in their jobs and controlled inflation. But it's interesting. So the petrodollar was set up in 1973, and of course, the bankers who owned the Federal Reserve couldn't have all the money going to the people selling the oil in the Middle East. So they had to come up with a way to get clip the ticket and get the money transferred back to the US. So they came up with the petrodollar, which basically is the biggest physical commodity in the world. And of course, the biggest paper commodity in the world is the US Treasury bond market. We've been brainwashed, and I myself was brainwashed. I knew it was never right, and I've spent my whole life trying to get to the bottom of it. But we're not allowed to print money, and I always found that a very difficult thing to understand, because all money is printed. All money is an arbitrary construct. All money actually comes out of thin air. And the question is, well, if you're going to print money out of thin air, how do you do it in a responsible manner? And the responsible manner, of course, is to actually match it against an asset that comes out of thin air. And of course, the assets that come out of thin air, of course, are the rain, the sunlight, the soil. And as we know from the words of our national anthem, wealth comes from toil. So if we go and farm the land, we dam the water, we build the power stations to actually dig up the coal or the uranium or the gas or whatever, we create wealth from nothing. And that is what we must do. And this is the problem with cryptocurrency and digital assets, apart from the social credit that will come along with it later on, is that there is no security against the hard assets. And that is what we must do as a government, and what the RBA must do. They must look at quantitative easing, and that was a recommendation in the 1937 Banking Royal Commission as a way to stimulate growth in this economy. Because if we're going to increase demand by jumping from 20 million people to 26 million people, and we've had another 500,000 people come in the last 12 months, we've got to increase supply. And the only way we can do that is tying our currency to hard assets. And that is why we need an infrastructure bank in this country that is actually going, and only for those seven sovereign assets: dams, power stations, road, rail, ports, airports and telecommunications. That is how, I've just read in the paper yesterday the states are saying they don't have any money to build infrastructure. You don't need money. If you're a sovereign country and you have title over all this wealth, you can issue equity. You can issue equity. And we've been brainwashed into thinking governments can only raise capital by issuing bonds. And of course, what's the biggest market in the world? The US Treasury bond market. And where does the US Treasury bond market come from? The Federal Reserve. And who owns the Federal Reserve? The private banks. So why are we, every time we build a dam in this country, say for $1 billion, and we go out and borrow $1 billion offshore of the petrodollar of private banks' dollars, the first $1 billion in wealth we create we've got to repay offshore. And then they charge us another, say, 4% interest for another 25, 50 years. That's another $1 billion to $2 billion going offshore. We have to actually start getting back to producing real goods and services in this country. We've got to get those white-collar traders out of those ivory palaces in the big cities and getting them back out there and building infrastructure. Now, if we go ahead and somehow try and legitimise this digital currency, which we will never be able to regulate, we will never be able to keep up with, we are going down a fool's paradise. We're going the wrong way. So I will be voting against this bill because we need to get back on the tools and we need to build this country in the same way our forefathers did.
Authorised G. Rennick, LNP Chermside.